This is Audible. From the series and Volume 1 of The Unseen City, Salazar's Touch. The White Boy by Kevin B. The White Boy. Nate squeezed his son's hand as they entered the church. "We're here, Samantha." Walking to a pew near the front, Nate allowed himself to relax. He had to admit that joining the church after his wife's death was probably the best decision he had ever made. Aside from marrying her, of course. Samantha had grown up in the church, and while Nate had once been skeptical of her upbringing, the church had ultimately saved him after her death. New in town with a newborn, he knew no one. But the church and everyone in it had embraced him and Jeremy without hesitation. The city had a good balance between believers and non-believers, crime and safety, locals and newcomers. It was the perfect place for a fresh start. That's what Nate Diaz Mackenzie had concluded 4 years ago when he moved to Ottawa with his newborn son, Jeremy Samantha Mackenzie, after suing both the City of Montreal and the Montreal Police Department for his wife's accidental death. A speeding police patrol vehicle had taken Samantha's life, and though Nate won the lawsuit, the victory felt hollow. In his grief, he renamed his son's middle name after his wife, a decision he knew older Jeremy would wrestle with, but his sorrow overruled any concerns about playground teasing. With the settlement money, he and Jeremy started anew in Ottawa. Nate loved working with his hands. A carpenter by trade, he had been part of an aggressive contracting team in Montreal. But after the lawsuit payout, and with the demands of single fatherhood, he decided to scale down and open a small, cozy carpentry shop in Vanier, Ottawa. Though the doorbell rarely rang, the shop was always lively and messy, with 4-year-old Jeremy Samantha running up and down the aisles. Little Mackenzie ran amok in the store, sometimes engaging customers in deep conversation in an attempt to mimic his father, who was his entire world, and vice versa. Ottawa was perfect for Nate. His shop was 5 minutes from home, and Jeremy's school was just a block away. For a single dad, regardless of financial means, this setup was ideal. Their traditional Sunday morning drives to church were an exciting outing for Jeremy, who was always spoiled by the 13 familiar faces he saw every week, receiving both treats and minor wardrobe adjustments. The Sunday drive also held meaning for Nate. He didn't consider it a chore. He viewed the congregation as family. Nate wrestled with his faith. Samantha had been the believer, not him. She wasn't supposed to die first. She used to joke about heaven and hell, trying to convince Nate to attend church. He'd always tease back that he'd go when he died, but only if she planned on joining him. She'd laugh, imagining herself left behind, praying fervently to sneak his soul into heaven. But when Nate arrived in Ottawa with a newborn and no idea how to care for a baby, the church adopted him. Members visited him with food and baby clothes. When Jeremy lost a little weight, some of the elderly women even collected breast milk from their daughters and dropped off bottles at his house. They all knew about Nate's newfound wealth, but no one cared. They cared about Jeremy, and by extension, Nate. After his first year with them, he vowed at Samantha's grave that he would take Jeremy to church every Sunday for the foreseeable future. His relationship with Samantha had been balanced. She was the smarter one, but she let him lead, or at least allowed him to believe he did. Their arguments were few, but their biggest recurring debate had been about Nate's refusal to go to church. Every Sunday she would plead, bargain, and negotiate, but he always responded with an irritated, "No," followed by a grumpy silence that lasted at least 24 hours. Now, in his grief, he had made a vow, perhaps meaningfully, perhaps ignorantly, to ensure their son grew up in a church environment, knowing full well Samantha would have fought for the same. The pandemic had severely impacted church attendance. It had always been difficult to fill even half the pews before COVID. But now, even with restrictions lifted, attendance was worse. Last Sunday, little Jeremy counted only 10 people in the congregation, including Pastor Frank Costa. Proud of his counting skills, he eagerly announced his findings to everyone. They all reacted with the same pattern, a congratulatory smile and a playful pat on the head. But Jeremy was too young to notice the despair that followed each smile once he trotted away. The dwindling attendance saddened everyone. Many had left for that very reason, without recognizing the irony. Others still attended for social interaction, but without a crowd, the social aspect had disappeared. This Sunday, March 27th, 2022, felt different in several ways, though the number of attendees remained the same. Jeremy had been unusually eager to go to church that morning. He woke up early, cheerful, already dressed. Poorly, as expected, since Nate would redo his outfit anyway. But he knew the ladies at church would fuss over Jeremy's bow tie and shoelaces as they always did. He was their unofficially adopted grandson. The usuals, as Nate and Jeremy called them, always sat in the same seats every Sunday. Nate always made sure to sit where Samantha had sat, a small, silly hope that, if the spirit world was real, she'd be pleased to see their son in her old spot, right in the middle of the church, by the aisle. Then there was Pastor Frank Costa, a rugged 65-year-old Cuban man who never seemed to stop moving. He didn't look or act his age, always seen after church loading furniture onto a truck for families in need. A former ranch hand in Cuba. He later ran a small construction business, but only when the Holy Spirit told him to, a phrase he repeated so often that even his congregation teased him about it. Little Jeremy had once overheard these jokes and chimed in, laughing, "Uncle Frank is in love with the Holy Spirit." The church had erupted in laughter. Behind Nate and Jeremy sat Miss Jennifer McPherson, a 69-year-old white widow who had once been Jeremy's full-time nanny. She adored him, but that changed when Nate overheard her tell Jeremy, "Oh, Jay, you're my baby boy. We're going to go far away and be happy forever and ever." It was probably innocent, maybe just a song, but it unsettled Nate. Pastor Frank tried to reassure him, but soon after, a teenage girl named Letitia told Nate that she had overheard Jennifer asking Jeremy strange questions, like whether his father ever yelled at him and if he wanted to live with her. Alarmed, Nate and Pastor Frank agreed that Jennifer should no longer babysit Jeremy or be alone with him. Nate trusted Pastor Frank's judgment, but he still tensed whenever Jeremy ran into Jennifer's arms on Sunday mornings. Pastor Frank would catch Nate's eye and offer a reassuring smile. Letitia, now Jeremy's nanny, had been instructed to keep an eye on Jennifer, though discreetly. As a teenager with a secret crush on Nate, she had extra incentive to do the job well. Letitia and her grandmother, Christine Boabre, always sat a few rows ahead. Originally from Senegal, Christine was the community's social glue, hosting Friday night bingo games that fueled Sunday gossip. To escape the drama, she once invited Pastor Frank, only for him to become the most enthusiastic gossip of all. Then there were Matthew and Patricia McCauley, a quiet, retired couple who kept to themselves but came alive at social events. Every Sunday they snuck into church like thieves and slipped out just as quietly. Except when Jeremy came bounding their way, demanding candy, and attention. For now, the church still stood, and the usuals remained. But how long would that last? Though deserving of more attention, the usuals typically kept to themselves, even in social settings. Each carried their own burdens. There was Ms. Jennifer Pearson, a 75-year-old white woman, and a former lady of the night. Though now wrinkled like a dried prune, she was once the most sought-after comfort for those willing to pay. She could barely move these days, but always found the energy for church every Sunday. She would rush in, either early or on time, yet always out of breath. She always sat at the very front, suspected to be her way of ensuring she was first in line for heaven. She believed, yet she had her doubts. Her past weighed heavily on her. Hisham Fulham, a 43-year-old black man of Somali descent, converted to Christianity 3 years ago. Proud of his faith, he spoke of it loudly among fellow believers, though his family and friends had shunned him and secretly struggled with his choice. Absent that morning was Alexis Costa, Pastor Frank's adopted son, a University of Ottawa student who was secretly bisexual. He had midterms and was most likely studying at the library. Also missing was Cécile Gagnon, a 34-year-old TD bank clerk with a gambling problem, now deep in debt to local bookies. With the pandemic and financial troubles, church attendance had fallen off her priority list. Jebediah Freeman, the church janitor and a 50-year-old Jamaican man, had promised Pastor Frank he would always attend Sunday service if given the job. He kept his promise for a few months, before preemptively blaming his future absences on the pandemic. Yet he never missed a workday or a payday. After the events that unfolded that morning, Pastor Frank later thanked God the church had been so empty. It was during the sermon, as Pastor Frank spoke passionately about the lack of faith in today's society, a topic no one in attendance would contest, as they were there searching for faith themselves. Meanwhile, little Jeremy, stealthily running from row to row, suddenly froze in the aisle, 2 rows ahead of his father. He stood upright, his legs stiffening together as though bound by an unseen force. His arms were pulled upwards, stiffening laterally, followed by a visible, uncontrollable shiver. Pastor Frank, Nate, and Letitia, who had been watching him closely, leaped toward him in a confused attempt to intervene, though it was clear the situation was beyond their understanding or control. Before they could reach him, an intense burst of wind filled the church's interior. Bibles and hymnals flew wildly, later swirling in circles as everyone struggled to hold on. Nate instinctively turned toward the doors, expecting to see evidence of a storm. But the doors were shut, and the windows remained intact. Yet the wind raged. Jeremy stood in the aisle, upright and almost on his toes, his eyes rolled back so that only the whites were visible. In the chaos, amid the frantic congregation, Jeremy began to repeat a phrase in an unknown language, his voice growing louder with each repetition. He stood there, so young, so frail, yet stretched out like a man on a crucifix, uttering words foreign to all, enveloped in what could only be described as a whirlwind. Letitia had taken refuge beside her grandmother, who was crouched on the floor, knees tucked in and hands covering her head in fear. Despite her terror, she sneaked a glance at Letitia, noticing her granddaughter's determination. Letitia braced against the benches, anchoring both herself and her grandmother, while in a remarkable display of millennial multitasking, she managed to record the entire event with her phone, using only her left hand. Jennifer Pearson had been pushed toward the altar stairs, clinging to them, for dear life. Pastor Frank, abandoning his effort to reach Jeremy, curled up on the floor, watching in astonishment as the boy repeated the phrase over and over. The Macaulays held each other in a tight embrace against the wall, staring at the child in terror. Hisham, quick on his feet, had bolted to the service room at the first sign of trouble. Now he peered through the door, gripping the knob tightly to keep it from flying open. He too heard Jeremy's voice, though what he heard was not a child's voice anymore. Nate, the closest to Jeremy, had been thrown headfirst into a bench. Though dazed, he held on firmly, staring at his son helplessly, dumbfounded. The event, though lasting barely 30 seconds, would stay with them for years. The wind died suddenly, and Jeremy collapsed gracefully to the floor, deep in sleep. Nate rushed to his son, hugging him fiercely, his mind spinning. It took minutes for the congregation to gather themselves. Even then, words failed them. The immediate response was one of silence, a solemn, reflective stillness. Pastor Frank helped Jennifer to her seat before hurrying to Nate and Jeremy. She sat speechless, glancing behind her at the boy lying unconscious in his father's arms. The Macaulays, still holding on to one another, inched forward cautiously. Hisham had the most profound reaction, emerging from the service closet with wide eyes and slumped shoulders. He slipped onto a bench and began to sob uncontrollably. He had just witnessed a miracle, and, at that moment, he knew, without a doubt, that he had made the right choice. The rejection, the ridicule from his family and friends suddenly meant nothing. He felt light. He felt joy. He felt vindicated, and he wept openly, oblivious to the stares of the still stunned congregation. Letitia had helped her grandmother to her feet, joining the growing crowd around Jeremy. Grandmother Bouba was more fearful than awestruck. Her mind leapt to the stories of witchcraft and sorcery she had heard growing up in Senegal. She approached with caution. Letitia, however, was fascinated and proud of her recording, until Pastor Frank confiscated her phone upon noticing her showing the footage to the Macaulays. Yet even in her curiosity, Letitia remained observant. Her eyes locked onto Yennefer, who, though in shock, was the only person still acting with purpose. She gripped the bench before her, eyes fixed on Jeremy. Yennefer was the first to call for help. She traded her shock for action, prioritizing Jeremy's well-being. Her voice was clear and firm as she spoke to the paramedics. "My son just had a seizure or some episode. I need an ambulance at the church. Yes, he's 6 years old. No allergies. Yes, he passed out, but he's regaining consciousness." Nate and Letitia exchanged glances at her words. "My son," but Yennefer stood tall, unwavering. She had made her decision. She wanted Jeremy, and she didn't care how it sounded. Hisham continued to sob, lost in reflection, while the rest of the congregation inched toward Nate and Jeremy. Nate held his son tightly, unwilling to let go. Part of him feared what all of this meant. He clung to Jeremy, as if releasing him might change something irreversible. Pairs of shocked, expectant eyes bore into him, waiting for an explanation. An answer he didn't have. His son had just ascended into the air, speaking in a language unknown. He wasn't just curious. He was terrified. He had struggled with faith for most of his adult life, and just as he was beginning to open himself to it, this happened. Why would God manifest this way? And why through his son? But as he gazed at Jeremy's sleeping face, he noticed something. The boy looked radiant, full of life, flushed with color. Whatever had happened It was undeniable. It was real. The church fell into a deep, eerie silence. Pastor Frank finally stepped forward, staring at Jeremy as if trying to decipher the divine. Yennefer, standing across the room, longed to hold the boy, but knew she wouldn't get the chance. Instead, she held tightly to her phone, waiting for the paramedics. Then, the screech of tires and the wail of sirens shattered the silence. The church doors flew open as paramedics rushed in. The congregation parted, allowing them through. They moved quickly, stethoscopes ready. But the stretcher they carried would not be needed. "What happened to him?" one of the paramedics asked while assessing the little boy's condition. The entire hall fell silent. No one spoke. No one could. How do you explain the unexplainable? How do you tell someone what happened when you yourself are still in shock? How do you explain to paramedics that a 6-year-old boy happily playing along the pews in church suddenly froze, his body stiffening as though seized by an unseen force, his eyes rolling back into his head as he ascended into the air without any visible support? How do you account for the sudden gust of wind so powerful it knocked people from their seats? And let's not forget the most unsettling detail. How a child, who had only ever spoken English, suddenly began speaking fluently in an unfamiliar tongue. How could anyone recount the incident without sounding insane? Even thinking about it felt like questioning their own sanity. "What happened to him?" the paramedic repeated, this time slower. The congregation exchanged uneasy glances, but only Nate kept his eyes shut, clutching his son tightly. Yennefer started, clearing her throat as she struggled to find the right words. He just had some kind of... It was... She faltered, her uncertainty evident. Thankfully, Pastor Frank intervened, cutting her off. "A seizure," he stated firmly, turning to face the paramedic directly. "It was some sort of seizure. We don't know what caused it. We were in the middle of the service, and he was running around like always, but then, suddenly, he just started to..." He hesitated, searching for a plausible explanation. "His entire body started shaking. Slowly at first, then violently. His eyes rolled back, and as soon as his father, Nate," he gestured toward him, "got hold of him, his body went stiff. And then he just lost consciousness, like he fell asleep. That's when we called you." Pastor Frank glanced at the worried faces around him. Like him, they all wished this version of events was the truth. They needed it to be true, needed it to replace what they had actually witnessed. It wasn't exactly the truth, but it was the best version they could give the paramedics without completely altering the course of their lives, especially Jeremy's. It was a necessary lie to protect the boy from whatever might come next. The paramedic studied Pastor Frank and Yennefer, his expression skeptical. Finally, he said, "Well, there doesn't seem to be anything wrong with him. His heartbeat is strong, and his vitals are perfect. It was probably just a minor tantrum or something. He's sound asleep now and should wake up any moment. He'll be fine. But call us if you notice anything unusual." Nate exhaled in relief. He had never believed his son had a medical issue, but hearing the paramedic confirm it was still reassuring. The team packed up their equipment, advising Nate to give Jeremy some vitamins, not due to any concern, but as a general precaution. As they were about to leave, Jeremy stirred, sneezing 3 times before opening his wide, playful eyes. The congregation visibly relaxed at the sight, though a lingering tension remained. The paramedics departed, and Jeremy, as if nothing had happened, was soon out of his father's arms, playing again. Yet, as he laughed and ran, The rest of the church stood frozen in fear and confusion, unsure of what to say. Letitia clutched her phone. "I think I recorded most of it," she murmured, glancing at Nate. "If you want it for Jeremy's doctor." Nate scratched his forehead, uncertain. A doctor wasn't what he needed. An exorcist seemed more appropriate. "I can take Jeremy for a few nights," Yennefer offered. "A change of scenery might do him good. Besides, Absolutely not," Nate cut in sharply. "There's no way I'm letting you near my son. He won't be going anywhere with you." "I will watch him closely, so don't worry about that. He'll be fine. I am his father, I love him, and I'll take care of him. He doesn't need to sleep in your house for any reason. Just look at him." He gestured to Jeremy, who was happily munching on a piece of candy Granny Christine had given him, giggling without a care. "Does he look like he needs help? Does he look scared or confused? Whatever happened is over. If I need to look into it, I will. But I don't need you filling his head with nonsense." His expression hardened. He couldn't believe she would use such an incident to push her own agenda. Yennefer glared at him, her dislike evident. "Maybe your past escapades and lifestyle haven't been the best environment for Jeremy. Maybe he needs—" "Yennefer," Pastor Frank interrupted, his gaze warning her to stop. "The boy stays with his father. Nate has cared for him all these years. There's no reason to take him away unless he asks for it, which he hasn't." Yennefer's face remained sour, but she said nothing more. "Pastor Frank," Hisham finally spoke, his voice small. "What did we just witness?" Pastor Frank sighed. "I think we may have witnessed a miracle. Or maybe the boy was just exhausted." He forced a smile, attempting to ease the tension. The congregation wasn't convinced. They knew what they saw, but logic forced them into denial. "We have no way of knowing what this was," Matthew Macaulay muttered. "For crying out loud, none of us understood what the child was saying." And those eyes. But Nate and Yennefer silenced him with sharp glares. Denial, for now, was easier. A week passed. The church members distanced themselves from Jeremy, their warmth replaced by caution. Hugs became high fives. Small corrections in his attire were now ignored. Jeremy felt the change, but was too young to understand. So he simply spent more time with Letitia and his father. Speculation ran rampant. But a week later, Letitia approached Pastor Frank. She had found an online translator on Fiverr who had deciphered Jeremy's words from the recording. Only Pastor Frank and Nate knew she had a video of the event. But now it had served its purpose. The translation, though loose, was unsettling. For all those who seek peace in the afterlife, know this: your agony, your peace, your despair, your wealth, happiness, and pain will be multiplied by 7 once you take the eternal sleep. Heed these words. There is no heaven or hell, only an extreme exaggeration of your life on earth. Pastor Frank, though skeptical, verified the translation with old linguistic grimoires. The results were eerily similar. Shaken, he informed Nate. For days, both men pondered its meaning. Ultimately, they decided to keep the translation a secret. They sat in silence in Pastor Frank's office, each contemplating the implications. If true, the revelation could change everything they believed. But the world wasn't ready for it. Neither was Jeremy. Calls and unsolicited visits from curious church members increased, making Nate uneasy. He knew how quickly people could turn on someone they didn't understand. He thought of his son and realized what had to be done. That night, under cover of darkness, Nate left town with Jeremy. Pastor Frank convinced him to stay in touch and promised that neither the video nor the translation would ever be revealed. Nate agreed to notify him of any further incidents. 2 years have passed. The congregation has moved on, except for Yennefer, who still resents Jeremy's sudden disappearance, and Pastor Frank, who, if pressed, would hesitantly admit he hasn't truly moved on either. He checks on Nate and Jeremy, often, watching over the boy from a distance, still waiting and wondering. Hope you enjoyed this short story from the Unseen City. Salazar's Touch Volume 1. I took great pleasure in writing these stories, and though riddled in fiction and creativity, I owe the city Ottawa for its inspiration and its disposition.